Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, which is a community working to support and promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out other shows like Tech Won't Save Us, Anti-Girl Boss Socialist Club, and Alberta Advantage. You can look at the shows list at harbingermedianetwork.com. So welcome to Victor's Children. I'm joined today by three guests I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with about the question of the socialism we need. Socialism is something that is perhaps more in the air these days for a lot of people than it used to be, but there are a lot of questions that arise from that. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So I've got three people, all based, I think, in Toronto at the moment, to be part of this discussion. I've got John Clarke, Saima, Desai, and James Graham. And maybe we could just do introductions in that order.
Yeah, so I'm John Clarke, and I was for many years an organiser with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. I presently hold the position of Packer Visitor in Social Justice at York University.
Hi, I'm Saima. I am currently in Toronto on Dish with One Spoon territory. For the last 5 years, I've been the editor of a magazine called Briar Patch, which is based in Treaty 4 territory in Regina and has for 50 years been reporting on social movements and grassroots politics. Right now, I'm on a 1-year leave from Briar Patch, resting, living in Toronto close to my loved ones, and working another job. Right now, I'm the project manager on an academic research project called Infrastructure Beyond Extractivism, which is looking at how do we do a just transition in a way that restores Indigenous jurisdiction to the land.
And I'm James. I'm also based in Dish with One Spoon territory in Toronto. I'm a writer, artist, an abolitionist social worker, and I do housing and harm reduction research.
Thanks, all. So I think a place to begin would be just to talk a little bit about socialism and what we mean by it, because the word can refer to a number of quite different things, different ways of organizing society, some that have existed in the past, a few that exist today, and others that haven't yet existed in history. But in so-called Canada today, I think more people probably, if you ask them what they mean by socialism, how they understand it, they would essentially say something like, it's when the government does things for people. That probably would be the most influential understanding, whether they think that's good or bad. And then there are certainly some people who identify themselves as socialists who understand it that way. But I think the word socialism is really associated with trying to name something that isn't capitalism. And so there's a struggle over what that actually means. I would say it's part of the broader battle of ideas in society. So I guess I'd like to start us off by talking about, as socialists, what kind of society do we name when we say socialism? What kind of society is necessary, possible, and worth working towards?
Well, then I'll perhaps begin. I think the thing about socialism, I think the point is well taken, that precisely because we're in a period when some people are beginning to gravitate to notions of socialism, the sense, the Bernie Sanders sort of, it's a bit like Denmark or Sweden sort of approach is what a lot of people have in mind, and in some ways that's a healthy instinct to want to put limits on the neoliberal agenda. But if we're talking about socialism, we must be talking about a society that is not just the Nordic plan. We have to be talking about a society in which there is collective ownership, in which there is a real empowerment, in which exploitation is removed from. And it seems to me as well that there are decisive questions about socialism in the sense that it isn't just sort of some plan that is adopted and put into place. It must come out of a mass struggle, a revolutionary struggle. And so it must be shaped by that struggle. The mass of people who engage in that struggle and the organizational forms that they take up have to be the basis for the creation of a socialist society. And decisively as well, I think we also have to recognize that if we're talking about anti-capitalism in the Canadian context, we're also talking about anti-colonialism. We're talking about fundamentally reversing the colonial process, and that's an integral part of socialism here.
Thanks, John. It's a bit intimidating to be in a podcast with you because I feel like you've been doing socialism for decades, and I feel like
I've just reinforced all my mistakes, but never mind.
Yeah, I think John has covered the basics. To give a little bit of context about where I'm coming from, I didn't grow up as a socialist, and I didn't grow up in a socialist family. I grew up in a relatively wealthy, relatively right-wing family, and so I come to socialism relatively recently, and so I remember some of the things that convinced me to become a socialist and some of the things that moved me from calling myself just an anti-capitalist to calling myself a socialist. And so to me, and as to many other people, socialism at its core is a way of organizing life that aims at meeting human needs, rather than a capitalist system, which is aimed at producing profit. And so production in a socialist system would be democratically planned to meet human needs. And so those two core parts are democracy and the sustenance of life, the sustenance of what is vital. To me, meeting human needs also includes having a non-destructive relationship with the rest of nature. And so I think, to me, socialism inherently, there's been many ways that socialism has been mobilized, many ways of organizing society that people have called socialist. But to me, my understanding of what the only way that socialism could truly happen would be democratically, with a commitment to liberation rather than reconstituting new forms of rule over each other. And ultimately, all of that leads to this idea that socialism is not just a hoped for ideal, but it's a necessity, in that socialism is our choice between going down the path of capitalism, which leads to sort of inevitable extinction of life, human life and other life, or it's the choice to build another way to organize ourselves and live together.
Those were both so good. And so I'm very happy to be coming after both of those, but again, a little bit intimidated as well. And yeah, I guess just to start off, I think a lot of people do have that idea, right, that socialism is when the government does stuff for us. And I think a big reason for that is that people really, really need help, whether it's healthcare, housing, social and mental health supports, food security. People are just really desperate right now. And I think for most of us, in our lives, we've only really experienced either getting some of these residual supports through the kind of crumbling state apparatus that provides them at sort of a bare minimum level, or just nothing at all. So I think understandably, right, people have this idea that that's the window of options. I think there's this, like we have pretty low expectations, right, growing up in a system like that. And I think it's incredibly possible for us to have something maybe unthinkably better, but that doesn't feel realistic in our current context. I think as things are right now, there's this sort of pit at the bottom of society, right, that we're all kind of aware of, that just sort of swallows people up. There's no floor really for how bad things can get. And I think the fear of ending up there, even for those of us who aren't in that type of immediate crisis, sort of keeps all of us in line. In the book Health Communism, Beatrice Adler Bolton and Artie Verkant talk about the surplus population and how we really sort of need to rethink and center people who've been discarded by capitalism in our organizing. And I think for me, the reason that I became a socialist was that I saw that firsthand. I saw the way that people are just sort of ground into dust and forgotten about at the edges of capitalism. And I think for me, the society that we need is one where that runaway train of human suffering is fully stopped, not regulated and sort of tinkered with, right? Like, oh, how much like needless human death is acceptable, but no needless human death is acceptable. We need a society that doesn't leave people to die. Every human being deserves to be warm and safe and cared for, and to have the ability to live their life to its fullest potential. And we need to end the phase of destructive predatory relations with the land and with each other.
One thing that's just come to mind from what you said, that the title of the book you mentioned, Health Communism, just speaks to the fact that there are more people now using the word communism with a small c, than I think used to be the case in this part of the world a number of years ago, in part because of the confusion around the word socialism. And the word communism has more kind of radical connotations for some people. So I think there's been a kind of a reclaiming of that, which is also interesting. I think we probably all agree that what matters not so much is the words, but what people actually mean by them. And I don't know what the language of the next socialist movement is going to be. It'll be both, I think, a mixture of things inherited from past traditions and new language. But there is, the most important thing is to have clarity and to engage in a battle of ideas about the content, about what we actually mean. Because I think coming from different places, we're actually all, I think, very much on the same page, the four of us in this conversation about what we mean. And we're talking about a society which is, radically different than capitalism in the ways that you've named. And that, one thing that probably is worth flagging is that in our time, we're more conscious of the fact that a transition towards socialism would have to be one which was very much based on trying to establish a meaningfully sustainable relationship with the rest of nature. It's probably we have to be more conscious of that than any previous generation of socialists had to be, because of the level of ecocidal destruction that capitalism has unleashed, and that kind of process would not be immediately, brought to an end by the beginning of a transition to socialism. But there has to be a process of damage control and repair as people try to dig themselves out of the disasters that are piling up because of capitalism.
I think also, to your point about people thinking that socialism is when the government does things for people, I think that has been a deliberate message put forward by the right very effectively in many ways. Like, large swaths of the right call people like Justin Trudeau socialist, and they call any kind of like government intervention or regulation socialist. And so I think a lot of people are confused right now, and they've confused the sort of horrible neoliberal governments that we live under with socialism, and they don't have the ability to see or aren't allowed to see through this thick fog of right-wing propaganda what socialism really is and really could be.
Right. If I could say, I think as well that sort of approach, and I think that's absolutely true, that the official discourse sort of looks to very necessarily slander the concept of socialism. But whatever I'll use the term they, say about socialism, they view it as something that, even if they regard it as utterly reprehensible, their notion is that it's something that would be imposed on people. Because the notion of people actually themselves being in control and is unimaginable to the people who run this present society. But that seems to me to be the vital question about building socialism, is that it can only emerge. I mean, Karl Marx talked in terms of working class people getting rid of the muck of ages in the process of struggling for a different society. And we're not going to build a different society based on somebody coming up with a better plan and imposing it on people. That's the whole thing about socialism. It has to be won through the struggle that the mass of people actually engage in. And so it's not just a question of, hey, would this be a good idea? Would that be a good idea? Which do you want to vote for? It's a question of what are you prepared to do to build it and to fight for it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just adding on to both of those comments, I think my favorite example of the right-wing idea of socialism being completely backwards is when Justin Trudeau bought the pipeline with all that public money. That was widely regarded as socialist by his right-wing opponents. But, I can't really think of anything more antithetical to my idea of like a socialist or communist society than, spending a bunch of public money that could have been spent on, solving any of the myriad of problems that are immiserating people right now, instead to fund colonialism and resource extraction, right? So we can really see how blatant that kind of misdirection is. And I think a big reason that communism has caught on is sort of adding on to what John was saying, that the term socialism for some people is this kind of managerial approach to society of, this class of experts, maybe even progressive experts, but who are still kind of calling the shots while most of us just work. And I think the idea of communism is more and more appealing to people because it's hints at some sort of broader transformative change to all of social relations, a complete restructuring of how we interact with each other and how we work, what work means. And I think especially in the ecological crisis that's becoming more and more urgent.
Then I think you've, touched on a number of really important questions. And one thing that then kind of emerges out of this is how we can best make the case for this kind of a society that we want to people who now recognize that, that capitalism is something that we need to be rid of because of all the harm that it's doing, but at the same time are full of doubt about whether what we're talking about is possible, right? Because I think we're in this, that's something that's really true of the moment that we're in, that the horrors of capitalism are increasingly obvious to people, but the confidence that the kind of society we're talking about is possible is not so much there. And I'm wondering, maybe, Saima, since you've kind of self-identified as the most recent person here to have switched from identifying as an anti-capitalist to being for socialism, whether you might want to start us off on that question.
Sure. Yeah, I think what John has been saying about how socialism is necessarily something that is democratic from the start, rather than this idea that people have that first we impose socialist economics and then democracy follows from that or comes second, but actually that the only way that there could be a transition to socialism is through socialist democracy. I think that is important. I lost my train of thought. But I think that there's that idea that socialism is not about a small group of radicals using the masses as an implement. It's about huge, huge numbers of people deciding together to radically transform society is really important. And I think part of the problem is that people don't have very much, if any, practice in working on that kind of transformation, of fighting for that kind of transformation, myself included sometimes. Like, I don't really consider myself an organizer. I've been involved in some campaigns and done some organizing, but I mostly make media, which is not the same. And I think also one thing that moved me from being a anti-capitalist to being a socialist is understanding a little bit more about capitalism and understanding socialist economics. So I think that learning about how crisis, so recession, war, environmental collapse, what we're seeing right now where it feels like we're destroying the best of human achievements and culture, all of that is a feature of capitalism and not a bug. And that this insight that humanity will eventually be exterminated if capitalism is not replaced, and understanding and not being surprised when capitalism enters a period of crisis and then scrambles to restore its legitimacy and shore itself up. So I think one thing that helped move me from, growing up in a fairly right-wing family and not being very politically engaged, and then sort of coming slowly through sort of anti-oppressive politics towards socialism, is learning a bit more about socialist economics. And I think that a lot of that stuff is being really usefully disseminated on social media these days. For example, I don't know, all over my social media, there's little infographics showing how over the decades, productivity has increased while wages have stagnated. I think that's, a really useful, incisive socialist economic insight. So I think disseminating those insights, it's, it opens up kind of a can of worms in this discussion about what can be achieved through media and pamphlets and flyers and social media versus what needs to be learned in the struggle and through fighting. I can speak more to the former because I make media, but media is the thing that moved me. And that's part of the reason why I still make it, because I believe that it can move others. And I think, but also I believe that part of it is teaching people that transformation is possible. And so I don't know, I think the kind of David and Goliath struggles that we're seeing, a lot of the time people don't win, and struggling is really hard, especially under the conditions that we live in, where people are deeply underpaid. They're fighting to keep their homes, they're fighting to keep their jobs and food on the table. They feel like they don't have time to fight, and that if they do fight, they won't win. But I think that stories of the ways that people have won, where tenants have successfully fought back against a landlord who was trying to evict them, those are really important. And also teaching people how to weather defeat and teaching them that we're not going to win all of the time, but that this is a decades-long struggle, even though things need to urgently change right now. And teaching them how to approach defeat and crisis strategically and with kind of this long-term thinking, where I spoke before about understanding that crisis is a feature of capitalism and not a bug, understanding that crisis will return over and over again, that we're in crisis right now and we will be in crisis again, and to take that in stride as part of our organizing and part of our fighting.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important that the whole question of struggle comes up and is put so front and center in the discussion. I mean, the reality is that if this could be presented, if some capitalist media institution said, "I've decided to play fair and give David's podcast full play and, get it out there and millions of people have access to it and we'll see where it goes." The fact is it would have a very important effect. It would educate a lot of people, but it still wouldn't be enough. It would have to, an understanding of socialism and an embrace of socialism by people is only going to be arrived at in the context of mass struggles. And that's what strikes me as so important about socialism at the moment, even though I acknowledge we have a few problems on our hands in terms of how to put this forward. But I think that's the point, is we have a situation now where ideas of socialism have, I'd be hard pressed to find another point in history when they were more relevant than this. I mean, it really is an incredible situation that we're in. I mean, it's been articulated here and it's quite correct. We are literally looking at the destruction of life on this planet. And we're looking at the term polycrisis is being bandied around, and it has a certain validity. I mean, in every way, whether it's biomedical, whether it's environmental, whether it's economic, whether it's the question of global rivalry, it's all coming together, and it doesn't appear that it's going to get better anytime soon. There's going to be, this crisis is going to deepen, and that's going to drive people to struggle. And I think the idea of socialism and the idea of a socialist entity is to try to intervene in those things and to try to influence them. And right now there is a crisis. Yes, people are looking at socialist ideas, but the immediate crisis in terms of movements is how to struggle effectively. Because you've got all of these movements you've got unprecedented mobilizations taking place right now in Britain and France, for example, where people are mobilizing in larger numbers than ever before, but they're being organized around the basis of, the good show, the day of action, the massive demonstration. There's no real winning strategy being put in place that's actually fighting to raise the level of economic disruption and political crisis to the point where victories and gains could actually be made. And it seems to me that the ideas of socialism and the perspective of socialism can play a really vital role in actually intervening in those struggles and trying to push them forward, precisely because we're not trying to broker a deal with capitalism. We're trying to destroy it. And that gives us, I think, tactically and strategically an incredible advantage. And I think this is a period when those ideas can really resonate with people, when they can really have an impact on the course of events. And I think I'm absolutely convinced that in the next few years, we're going to see a very large section of the population that embraces socialism. It's not guaranteed that it'll be enough. It's not guaranteed that we'll win. But I think those possibilities are there and they're being created. I mean, this is a time of incredible change when the openings for socialists are potentially enormous.
Yeah. Just to add on to both of those, I think the idea of radical change for so many people who are new to politics and who have seen things sort of stagnate for the worst over most of their lives, the idea of radical change does feel totally impossible in some cases. But I think it's very necessary and I think very possible for us to make the argument that winning socialism is actually far more possible than fixing capitalism. I think I talked a bit before about how the best we can kind of imagine under capitalism seems to be some kind of residual welfare state, but the conditions that allowed for the very brief welfare state that we had in North America were very specific, and it's not coming back. And I think that's becoming more and more obvious to most people. And I think that's why you see so many people nowadays who start out not necessarily even thinking of themselves as anti-capitalists, but just trying to make changes or reforms, maybe around climate change specifically. I know so many young people who are brought into politics just around environmental issues, and then they realize that the structures that are available to us right now to change anything are basically a farce. And then from there, you start to question the way that everything works. And I think we need to communicate to people that, something better really is possible, and that we actually have the resources to fix, like John said, the poly crisis that we're facing, right? Everything's getting worse so quickly because of, decades and decades of just forcing workers to do things that we know are unsafe, forcing people to cut corners. I think I'm thinking a lot about there's the rail disaster that happened in the US recently. And it was the same policies the rail workers were trying to strike over because they knew that it was unsafe. And now there's a whole town and surrounding area that's being poisoned. And there's just so many things like that are going on right now where it's not inevitable. And, the working class is so full of people who want to help other people, who want to develop the technology that we need to get out of, the climate crisis, who want to, do these things that they have the skills to do that we desperately need, but they're being sabotaged by capitalism because it's a fetter on humanity. And I think if we can really drive home both through, like media and through the experience of struggle, I think, which is so illuminating for this, to people that not only is a better world possible through socialism, but that it's really the only way for us to sort of emancipate ourselves from the constraints of capitalism that are keeping us from solving these crises.
This is a slight reframe of David's question, which I think is a good one. But the question that's kind of been preoccupying me is, why today are there so many people who seem to recognize the ills of capitalism but don't feel like it's possible to transform our society for the better? Like I agree with you, both John and Jamie, that that there is this growing recognition of the ills of capitalism. And I do think, there's probably been no time more ripe for socialism than right now. But I also feel like it's a moment of really profound despair and demobilization. I see it around me. I feel it in myself as well. I feel less energy within myself for organizing and for fighting. And I think understanding the reasons why people feel like it's impossible to transform a society for the better will allow us to better disseminate the idea that it is possible. So I agree that, what we need to do is disseminate the idea that it is possible and involve people in the struggle to show them that it is possible. But I'm also interested in understanding the obstacles or roadblocks we're facing before we even get there. And so I'm interested to hear what you two think. I think one of the big things that has influenced the last couple of years and the feeling of whether or not transformation is possible is the pandemic, and the sort of drain on everyone's health and resources and energy that the pandemic has been, and that neoliberal responses to the pandemic have caused. And I think that, for me, is part of the reason for this current moment of sort of despair and demobilization. But I'm curious what the two of you think. What are those main roadblocks to people believing that transformation is possible?
I can definitely relate to the feeling of demobilization caused by the pandemic. I think one of the last things I remember doing before the lockdown was participating in one of the Wet'suwet'en Solidarity rail blockades. And just being so exhilarated by that experience because, it felt like for the first time people were coming together in actually sort of mass anti-colonial solidarity, actually disrupting like the process of production while doing so. And it felt so amazing. And it really was an optimistic moment. And then shortly after, none of us were allowed to go outside. So that definitely put a damper on things. But I do think the pandemic has also further illustrated a lot of the contradictions that we're talking about. I will say that I think, at least for me, a big barrier to thinking that socialism was really possible was that I don't think we're certainly not taught socialist history in public schools, right? Or I'm assuming private schools certainly don't teach it. Any schools. And for me, what really clicked and made it feel like this was something we could actually do was learning about how many people, like millions of people, right, throughout human history in the past few centuries have died in the struggle for socialism. And that was something I was completely unaware of for so long. And I think when your understanding of history, and especially the history of the past few centuries, has all these gaps, right? It's just bad thing after bad thing, right? We're not really taught about the parts where people came together and actually did even briefly create something that worked. And I think as necessary as it is, right, to point out the things that aren't working about our current society, I think educating people about all the much better ways that things have been, and the brutality that has been directed at the people who have even temporarily built those better structures is very illuminating, even if it's also very sad sometimes. For me, it made me feel like I was part of a historical mission that needed to be finished, not just for myself, but for everyone else who had, suffered and died trying to fight for socialism. It made me feel like I had a responsibility to them, I guess, to do what I'm doing now.
I think that, the question of, people's consciousness, people's understanding, what holds people back, it comes up, and it's a really important question. And many of the things that have been talked about, I think, are true in terms of the things that demobilize people, though we are seeing certainly upsurges taking place in various places. And that's happened in Ontario with the education workers recently gave us a glimpse of some things that are possible. But when people talk in terms of, people being uncaring or apathetic, I think they entirely miss the mark. I think what holds people back is this sense of inevitability, a sense that things can't really be challenged. And I've referred to this many times. I'll never forget it. But I went down to a meeting in St. Catharines, Ontario, with this around when I was when I was an organizer with OCAP. And there was a woman sitting next to me who was on disability benefits. And she said this, which I thought was an incredibly honest thing to say. She said, I think the stuff you're doing is fantastic. I respect it so much and it's wonderful and such like. But the way I feel is, let's face it, governments are going to do what they're going to do, and there's nothing we can really do to change it. And although I politically disagree with her, and I think she's utterly wrong, I think it was an incredibly honest and an important way to frame things. Because I must say, by the end of the meeting, she had a clenched fist in the air. It really, I think, drives home the problem. But it's a problem, but contradictorily, it's also part of the dynamic that changes things. That seems a strange thing to say, but I think it's true. I don't like to sort of point to foundational Marxist writings as some sort of guide that you have to base yourself upon in totality. You have to learn the lessons of the period. But there is one thing that was said, was written, actually, Trotsky made the point in his History of the Russian Revolution. I've always thought of this. I've thought of this many, many times, is he makes the point that revolutions don't happen because people are radical and because people are far thinking. They actually happen because people are deeply conservative, right? People faced with incredibly changing situations will try to cling to the old ways. They will try to hold back. They will try to resist the conclusions that are threatening and dangerous. But that there comes this sudden moment when the changing of hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, just suddenly changes, and there's this sudden leap. And you've got a situation where the people who were telling you nothing could be done and go away and we don't want to hear this stuff are more radical than you are. And I think that's really that kind of explosive quality to the class struggle is something that's really important, because we are seeing these things breaking up. We are seeing these things flaring out. I mean, when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis by the cops, you saw a mobilization that was one of the largest that's happened in the United States. But it was contained, right? Obama played a pretty big role in containing it, actually, but it was contained. And that seems to define the period we're in. We're getting these feelings of incredible restiveness, and people are very angry, and you get this sudden explosion. But the tactics that are adopted are generally controlled by people who want to work out some kind of compromise that's not there to be had. And so that energy is frittered away, and people return to a feeling that, like the woman in St. Catharines, that not that much can change. And that seems to me where a real socialist force could make a real difference, because we're not fighting on that terrain. We're actually trying to find ways to move out of that. Again, there's no sort of ridiculous optimism is out of the question. We face a dire situation, and defeat is one of the possibilities. Catastrophic defeat is one of the possibilities, but so too is victory. And I think that socialism is the only possible way in which we're going to move towards victory.
I want to just come in with a couple of thoughts on the question that you asked, Saima, because I think, as we've talked about, obviously the experience of fighting and winning is really important shaping people's sense of what's possible politically. But then another thing that shapes that sense of possibility is the memory of past struggles, right? And the way those are transmitted or not transmitted, so that people, like right now, if you're in a moment with a lot of people who haven't experienced high levels of struggle that lead to victories, they also aren't part of living traditions that have passed on those experiences in the way that did happen, at different points in history. And so I think that it just in terms of trying to explain the moment we're in, I do think that's important, that the complete kind of or almost complete severing of the ties that would pass down from one generation of organizers to another, some of those histories and experiences and their lessons. I think that's part of it. And the other thing I think is just worth throwing into the mix as part of the picture is the world historical experience of Stalinism in the 20th century. The fact that so many people's hopes for socialism were invested in what I would say were non-socialist societies that were nevertheless seen as socialist, and their collapse then shaped people's sense of historical possibility in a really significant way. So I think those are also dimensions of the problem that we face.
Yeah.
Rosa Luxemburg, speaking of, not adhering too closely to historical Marxist texts, but she talks about how, fighting for reforms is sort of a training ground for building up to revolution. And I think, in the lifetime of people my age, things have mostly gotten worse, like living in Canada or North America. Housing is more precarious or just, totally out of reach to afford stable housing. Wages are stagnating. Work is more precarious. Life expectancies are down in North America. We haven't even really been winning the reforms. And so, I think that is also part of this feeling of not knowing what it's like to win. And also when you are part of a mass struggle, like in the summer of 2020 or the educators' strike, settling for less and not having that socialist analysis to help that struggle overflow its banks and help it, not settle for, merely tinkering with capitalism.
I'm wondering if we could move to the question of transition. I suspect we may be on the same page about this, but I think it's important to not just talk about socialism as a goal, but talk a little bit about what would be needed to actually make the break with capitalism and sort of transition to socialism, because that's a question where there's been, continues to be quite a lot of debate among people who do call themselves socialists. Anyone like to start us off on this?
Well, I think that to me, it seems to speak to what some of the stuff that we've already talked about in terms of the sort of the formative process begins under this system, right? You actually have to start to have the development of not just, a socialist consciousness, yes, but you actually have to have the struggles and the organizational forms that are needed to take forward the process of changing society, to take forward a revolutionary process. At every point, unless you're one of these people who believed that, we're going to win an election and we're going to have a few big demonstrations to intimidate the other side, and we're just going to introduce a program through Parliament of socialist change, unless you believe that, there is actually going to have to be a revolutionary process. And so the forms and the organizational forms that will be developed in that struggle will be the basis for the new system in many, many ways. I don't want to throw out outlandish all power to the Soviet cries here, but that I think is fundamentally true. It's that notion of how we engage in the struggle and how we organize in the struggle begins to lay the basis for the change in society. And then once you actually have power, once the revolutionary process has been engaged in, that lays the basis for the kind of participatory activity that's going to be necessary to actually reorganize society on the basis of not some group of experts or benevolent dictators, but on the basis of actually mass action.
Now, you touched on this. Maybe, John, you could just pick up on the point a little bit. I think it's important to maybe zero in a little bit on the revolution question. Because one reason would be we've seen, for example, the growth in the U.S. of the Democratic Socialists of America and a certain kind of a politics that have become dominant within that organization, and that has some influence through the media on the left in so-called Canada. A politics which very much calls itself socialist, but also very much rejects the idea of revolution, and argues that in fact in the 21st century that radical change is possible, but on the basis of precisely what you briefly dismiss, I think quite rightly. But maybe you could just elaborate a little more on your reasoning there, because there may be some people listening to this podcast who are not yet convinced that a revolutionary break is needed.
Yes, certainly. I think that let me say that I'm not wanting to spit at people who have the notion that they want to win elections and make change. And there are many very sincere people who I would consider comrades and be prepared to work with who put forward that perspective. But it is a disagreement, and an important one, and it has to be fought out and has to be debated to a conclusion and has to be challenged, I think. And I think what we come up against is that those people who think that we're just going to win an election and then use the existing state structure to try to change things and miraculously neutralize the other side are just fundamentally wrong. The present rulers who in this society are not just going to relinquish this. The power is going to have to be taken away from them physically. And that is going to be, in my opinion, literally a revolutionary process. But it's also true that the existing state structure is just not going to be able to be used to bring about socialist measures. You're not going to be able to tell the cops at the 51 Division, we had a revolution last Wednesday, so now we want you to go out and arrest developers instead of terrorizing racialized youth and beating up homeless people. It's not going to work that way. You're not going to go to the finance ministry and say, now your job is to reorganize society along socialist lines. You're going to have to build a different kind of state structure and a different form of governance. And it's not going to be, here I go again, but going back to the Paris Commune, it's not going to be simply a question of electing people. It's going to be a very participatory process. And the institutions of this state don't lend themselves to that. It's going to have to be a different kind of state that's created.
I showed up with more questions than answers, as usual. But John, you were talking about how the organizational forms that we create now will lay the groundwork for a revolutionary struggle and will be, in some ways, the form that revolutionary struggle takes. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, or maybe David will tell me to stop backseat driving here. But can you talk more about those organizational forms? What organizational forms do you think are the ones worth investing our time and energy in?
Yeah. It's obviously, I think, impossible to sort of come up with some kind of blueprint. By definition, we're talking about things that largely haven't happened yet. So it's not a question of, this is the plan. But what happens is that when working class people engage in struggle, they find ways to organize. And moreover, the state seeks to find ways to modify and contain those organizational forms. So as struggles break out, you do see, seeing it all over the world, the beginnings of kinds of assemblies. I think of the resistance committees in Sudan, those kinds of sort of like very rooted, deeply deeply within communities and deeply within oppressed populations, actual organizational forms that can sustain struggle. I mean, we mentioned the education workers. I mean, absolutely, we should work within the existing unions, but there's going to have to be organizational forms that actually develop rank and file power. Had you had that in the case of the education workers, when they said, well, Ford has withdrawn his rotten legislation, but he'll only do so if we agree to go back to the bargaining table and negotiate a substandard contract. Had there actually been a level of organization amongst those workers that was saying, no, wait a minute, that's just not going to happen, it would have changed the dynamic of the whole thing. And the potential was there. Even the leadership of the component, the education workers component, was deeply dissatisfied. You saw huge numbers of workers actually voting the thing down, but there was no capacity to actually put that anger into effect. And there could have been, and there should have been. And that's what I'm talking about, those kinds of forms. And then once you actually have a society that has moved beyond capitalism, that level of organization becomes the basis for organizing, not struggle, but organizing a new society.
I'll just mention there was a very good article recently published on the website, the journal New Politics, the US left journal, about the resistance committees in Sudan, or about more broadly the struggle in Sudan, including those committees. So I'll put the link to that in the show notes for anybody who wants to follow up on that particular case.
I just wanted to come in a bit on what John was saying and on David's question about, how do we sort of make the case that revolution is necessary, not, just working through the existing sort of state machinery. And I think for me, a lot of socialist theory on this subject really tries to make the case in sort of a technical way, right? Explaining that, objectively, the current state apparatus is hostile to socialism, is hostile to our goals and to redistribution. Because of real material economic factors, right? So just on a technical level, it's got to be revolution, right? Sorry. But for me, I think I want a revolution because I think a revolution is just, and because I'm angry looking around at the way that things are right now. I don't just want a revolution because objectively, unfortunately, the conditions call for it. I think anyone who looks around and, sees that the people who are in power right now are letting people freeze to death downtown in Toronto. They're letting the cops kill people indiscriminately, in the States. We have entire swaths of the political apparatus sort of terrorizing young queer and trans people. I think those people should be kicked out of the positions of power that they're in and kept out of them. And I think a lot of people feel that way, right? A lot of people, I think, have a lot more motivation to be involved in it, that sort of active revolutionary process where all of us, the masses of people, are brought into the public sphere with all of the grievances and anger that we have developed over lifetimes of capitalist immiseration. And, we built something totally new where this type of exploitation and systemic violence is not allowed anymore. I think that's a much more attractive offer than, we just elect our guy and I promise it'll work this time, even though it hasn't worked the last, every time we've elected our guy and everything stays the same. And I think, whether we like it or not, climate catastrophe, which keeps coming up in this discussion, but I think reasonably so, does kind of necessarily mean that things are going to radically change. I think it's just a matter of how they radically change, and whether or not we, and I mean the very, very broad we as the working class, are able to take the reins. And I think if you look at crisis situations that, have happened over the past decade or so, especially, ecological disasters and things like that, you do see some really inspiring examples of mutual aid, of people sort of taking matters into their own hands, creating these sort of ad hoc forms of organization and resource redistribution and things like that. Ideally, those forms would be, more organized and connected with each other so that we could be as efficient as possible. And I think that's where, we have to start doing that groundwork before things get to a crisis point. So, we know what resources we have to draw on. We know who's good at what. And we have established networks of people who have the same goals.
Yeah, I agree with you, James, about sort of this inevitability of, it's one path of the two potential inevitabilities, I guess. The inevitability of socialist revolution and of violent struggle as part of that socialist revolution. And I also feel, I think it's an open question to me, and it feels like a really delicate thing to talk about. How do we sort of abhor every drop of blood that is spilled while understanding that, as John says, the ruling class is not going to just hand over the reins. And also that we cannot use existing state structures for socialist ends, that we have to build things anew and we have to wrest power from the powerful. And how do we do that, understanding that it's going to require revolution, and that revolution is going to require a certain amount of violence, and that violence is likely justified because of the violence that we live under capitalism right now? And also, how do we not develop an appetite for that kind of violence, or begin to use violence as an end in and of itself rather than a means to an end? Another question rather than an answer that I am showing up with, but one that has been preoccupying me, although, maybe I'm kind of putting the cart before the horse right now.
I just, for myself, I suspect when we get to the question of the need to deploy revolutionary violence, the level of violence that people already will have experienced in the attempt to forestall it will sort of not make it that much of a moral dilemma. I think it'll be seen as something that's necessary and justified. And I think of an Iranian comrade I know who was involved in very violent armed struggle, and he said that he understood that what he had to do in many ways was grim, but he felt that he was motivated by the love of people and the desire to build a just society. And he didn't feel that he was corrupted by violent struggle. The dangers of deploying violence needlessly, or deploying violence on the wrong side. Well, there's plenty of examples of that to show that it's not a frivolous concern. But I think an ascendant movement that actually involves a mass of people can, in my opinion, overcome those problems.
Yeah, I think we definitely are quite a ways away from these questions becoming practical. And, it's like, as is right now, we are facing just this sort of daily onslaught of social murder that is so incalculable, right? When you think about it, like every little ramification of capitalism that sort of butterfly effects out and causes harm and death and illness, and we're sort of living in like this Ouroboros of human misery right now. And I think that does, like John said, I think that does justify quite a lot. But I don't know, I guess I think about it in the terms of I've been going to a lot of queer community events recently, and with the political atmosphere that we're in, we've started to have, someone at the door to make sure that people who are coming in to be at the event and not to hurt people, which is very scary, obviously. But when you're in these spaces and you see people, connecting with each other and expressing themselves and sort of building this tiny microcosm of human connection and joy amidst very, very bleak circumstances, the idea of just having to protect that, having to protect what we can build together that is good, it doesn't necessarily feel, like a violent or a hateful thing. It feels like something we're doing out of love for each other. And I think that needs to be sort of the core of what we're doing. The focus is that we are trying to build something better and ultimately to put an end to this very, very violent stage of human development. And I think we can have, we can focus maybe on a desire for liberation more than a desire for revenge, if that's a good way of putting it.
So I'd like to move us now to talk about the most difficult set of issues, really. I think what people used to call the tasks for socialists in jargony terms. But the question of, for those of us who do share this commitment in so-called Canada, a commitment to, the idea that socialism is necessary, possible, and worth fighting for, given that there are limited numbers of people and there are limited amounts of time, where people should actually be, or what people should actually be doing with their time and energy. And bearing in mind that, I guess 3 of the 4 of us have been members of socialist organizations and aren't at the moment, I think, which speaks perhaps to the state of the socialist left in this society, which is a definite element of the problem that we're grappling with. But would anybody like to start by sharing some thoughts about priorities, tasks, where we work, how we work, which is recognizing that there's not a single area. It's not like everyone should be doing one thing, right? And want to just get that out of the way. There are clearly many different important, valuable things that people can be working on. But thoughts on that to start us off?
Well, I'll say something to begin. I mean, I think we've all that term, the vanguard, is hanging over the discussion in some ways, and I think we've all seen. I mean, the concept of the vanguard, I think, needs to be discussed seriously politically anyway. But one thing we can all agree is that there's been a profusion of people who can, people who are sharing a taxi cab with a bunch of their mates consider themselves to be the continuity of revolutionary leadership and such like. And that has become a bit of a disorientating factor. I don't, I must say, reject the concept of political leadership. I wish that the language was somewhat allowed for that term to be more nuanced and explored than it is. But I do think the notion that a lead must be given and that there must be political ideas and strategies put forward is correct. I think that I don't think there is just going to be this ultra spontaneity that's going to happen. There is going to have to be people are going to have to fight for ideas, and people are going to have to advance ways forward and such like, and that will require forms of political organization. I think also we're at this period coincides with a crisis of socialism as a force that can provide leadership for a whole series of reasons. I mean, David mentioned Stalinism. Stalinism certainly turned off a lot of people, but what it also did was very seriously warped a whole generation of socialists. And that the legacy of that is still with us. We've still got enormous levels of disorientation that exist. And those who seek a way forward are themselves divided. There's real problems here. I believe that the building of some mass organization party remains a possibility, but I don't think that we could identify any group of people sitting around in a basement somewhere that are that we could say there's the nucleus of it. At the present moment, I think it's realistic to think of it, and there's an acute need to intervene. And I think there is going to have to be levels of cooperation amongst people that have some significant differences. I don't think there's a possibility of getting together, renting a hall and bringing together people and hammering out the manifesto that's just not a realistic option at this particular point, in my view. So I do think, yes, there are more questions than answers to this. Absolutely. But we have to begin to think in terms of, we've got this absolute crisis of effective social resistance at the moment, and there are ways forward. And how can we work together, those of us who share certain common assumptions, to take that forward?
I think I hear sometimes from people on the left this idea of like, whatever you are trying when it comes to leftist struggle is good. That, we're in this kind of like throwing pieces of spaghetti at the wall stage of late capitalism. And I don't know, you have all of these infographics circulating about people's different role in leftist struggles based on what their skills are, what kind of person they are. It's kind of like those, Enneagram tests or something that like tells you what your place in the world is. And yeah, it's kind of putting forward this idea that people just need to get involved and try everything. And in some ways I see the value of that. Like, I think we do need to be encouraging each other to get involved in the organizations that already exist, to move out of this space of inertia and demobilization and just, get some boots on the ground and have people start doing work, whatever that work may be, with whatever skills they do have. And then also, I think that we need to seriously talk about strategy and coordination, and thinking strategically about what struggles exist, where they are likely to go from, minor struggles to mass struggles, and where organized socialists would be able to help that struggle widen or spark into a mass struggle or overflow its banks. So, for example, what John was talking about when it comes to educator struggles, and how if there had been more organized rank and file workers who they may have been able to prevent labor leadership for settling for these shitty compromises that tinker around the edges of capitalism. So I think also trying to hold those two things together and trying to say to people, wherever you are and whatever you can do, start, and also to invite them to think strategically about where they are and what they can do. So for myself, I'm primarily an editor, sometimes also a writer. I work a lot on media, and I see media as, I think some people who work in leftist media see media as an end in and of itself, or think that, if we just put out the right magazine, that's going to make the revolution happen. And that's not true. So seeing it as one very specific tool in a wider toolbox, but understanding how it interacts with other people in struggle, and thinking about where to put our energies within media. So one thing I've been thinking about recently is there's a new publication in Toronto called The Grind that was started by a number of people, but primarily my former colleague, David Gray Donald, who used to work as the publisher of Briar Patch. And I think it's really interesting because it's such a different form of media than Briar Patch. Briar Patch is this 40-page magazine that comes out 6 times a year, and it goes out mostly to as the physical print magazine to paying subscribers and arrives on their doorstep. And then it's also available online for free. And it's read by people who are mostly university educated, who are already fairly well versed in leftist language and issues. And The Grind is doing something different, in part because of its form. It's a newspaper, an alt weekly, sort of in the style of the now mostly defunct Now Toronto, and it's being disseminated in TTC stations. And I've gone around with Dave and dropped off copies of The Grind at, like little restaurants and places where people grab a quick bite to eat, and coffee shops and bookstores. And the way that it's moving through the city is so different from the way that Briar Patch is moving through the city or through the country. And there's so much energy around The Grind, and people have so much appetite for, this thing that feels like it can reach people where they're at. And a lot of the time, when Dave goes into a coffee shop or something, and the cover of the Grind, I wish I had a cover with me right now, but the cover of the Grind has like the big grotesque faces of John Tory and Doug Ford on the front, and just saying something derogatory about it, and the workers love it and they laugh when they see it and they're like, yeah, absolutely, put it out. And then their managers predictably, or the owners of their companies predictably hate it. And yeah, just disseminating something that feels so vital, that feels full of life, that feels like it's reaching those people who we talked about before, who feel that there are big problems with capitalism and that their lives are getting worse and that the current economic and social systems are failing them, and putting something in their hands that tells them that things could be different and shows them who's already working on those things and shows them how to get involved. That feels really life affirming to me, really vital to me. And so that's one thing that I'm working on. I highly recommend getting involved in left-wing media work for people who like media, feel moved by media, are good at making media. And also for those people to have a little bit of humility, because they sometimes don't have the necessary humility, and to understand the role of media within a wider landscape or a bigger toolbox of socialist struggle.
I really like what you said about how, we're all sort of trying our best to interface in with the skills that we have, right? And how that's sort of different for everybody. I think for me, I'm very much coming from the place that I guess what I've decided to do, in the interim right now, where there isn't sort of a mass revolutionary upswing, is just doing my best to keep the people who have been, had those negative experiences with capitalism that you kind of need to have on some level to realize how much it sucks, just to keep those people alive for the time being, because there, I think, are so many people with the way that our society works that, all the ingredients are there for them to be a revolutionary militant, but because things are so bleak right now and can often feel so hopeless, and because people are so isolated, it's very, unfortunately, easy for those people to slip into complete demoralization or to sort of go down all sorts of bad roads and wind up in a bad place. So I'm just, I guess, doing what I can to, let people know that we need them here, and that there is something that we can actually do about this. And I think, when we talk about political organizing in our current context, that sort of bleakness, I guess, and isolation, it's a hard thing to overcome. I think a lot of us, especially, don't really know how to interact with other people as well as we will need to do a revolution. I think there are skills that we need to develop, like working together, communicating, and collaborating across difference. And Saima, like you were saying with Rosa Luxemburg, right, with the organizing being sort of the flexing of those muscles that we're going to need to develop to actually win. Even just organizing in small ways, I think, does teach us something, even if ultimately we realize that it was unproductive. I think in terms of vanguard sects, I'm not sure necessarily if that form of organizing helps build those muscles as well as we would hope, right? I think a sect produces maybe someone who's really good at going to meetings with other people who have all read the same books, but doesn't necessarily produce people who are good at intervening in the real movement and sort of meaningfully changing the course of events, which is more so what we need right now. So I guess I really don't have the answers on organizational forms. No one does. If anyone did, I think we'd be in a much better position. But I can say, at least right now, I'm very attracted to sort of coalitional politics of shared interests and struggle, and sort of recognized shared sources of suffering, right? I have been doing organizing recently, locally in Toronto, and there are a lot of different groups and organizations that all recognize that the Toronto Police and City Council are prioritizing corporate and real estate interests over oppressed and working class people. And I think that's good. It's good to see. Definitely still an uphill battle, but it's really good to see people recognizing that they have interests in common across difference. And I think those are, at least for now, that's where I'm going to be putting my energy. But I'm excited to see how things change, and I'm excited to see what people come up with, both out of creativity and necessity over the coming years.
Just to pick up on something that you said, James, I think that the importance of trying to be constructively involved where we see people in motion is so critical. And I think that we need to be, as socialists, we need to be really curious and have a kind of outlook of curiosity to see what moves and where people do begin to take action in ways that may not be where we expect it to come from or in the forms that we might expect it, and to try to then be constructive participants in that wherever possible, so that we can learn through that process and contribute politically, in terms of how we think we can help take the struggle forward. Certainly, I know in my experience, I was quite involved in climate justice organizing in Winnipeg, where I lived from mid-2019 into 2021. And I learned a lot working with people much younger than me, mostly, in that experience. And I do think that for the longer that people have been socialists and around on the socialist left, the more important it is to not just rest on your laurels or operate on the basis of assumptions that were formed in previous periods, but to try to be curious about where things might be moving, and to try to participate and learn from those experiences. And I think that is really important. And to the extent that we could then try to have people doing that in different places and in different sectors of struggle, to connect with each other and share experiences, and talk about how we can more effectively try to be socialist organizers wherever we are. I think that is an approach we should be trying to argue for wherever we can, and to cut against the tendency that you can. I think this is something which doesn't just affect people who've been Reds for a long time, but sometimes people who are pretty newly radicalized and considering themselves socialists, to avoid the problem of abstaining from things that don't meet your standards, that are seen as being not sufficiently radical. There's still such a terrible tendency to kind of clump together, rather than to seek out and engage and participate in the places where people are beginning to go into motion.
Yeah, I feel like the point that David and James made really resonates with me. That, James, what you said about how we need to get better at talking to people and working with people, or better than we currently are at it, and that involves and those skills for a lot of us have atrophied during the pandemic as we are stuck inside our homes, or sort of on these sometimes strange social spaces of Zoom meetings, and also for me that means getting good at exercising our muscle of democracy, of what actually participating in democratic member-driven organizations looks like, and also getting better at addressing conflict and harm within our organizations. I think that is sort of the next level of getting good at talking to people and working with people, is looking at what are the hardest parts of talking to people and working with people. And it's when we're in struggle with them, when we're in organizations with them, and people are being hurt, and how do we work through that? So for me, it's kind of a continuum there. But I definitely think that for myself, that's something I feel like is important to work on, and I see it around me, and I've seen so many organizations. I'm sure we've all seen so many organizations fall apart because of both very serious and very petty reasons of people not knowing how to work together to move through conflict, and to keep each other safe while we're organizing.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say I totally agree with that. And I think my sort of experience in that area was what really attracted me to like a lot of abolitionist writing. I think right now there's a lot of really interesting work that people are doing and kind of theorizing how we can relate to one another and like repair harm and deal with conflict in much better ways than we currently do. I think capitalism really doesn't give us the tools to have healthy relations with each other, right? And it can feel like that's something that will just sort of like naturally come after transformative social change, is that on sort of a more micro level, our relationship with each other will become healthier. But definitely from looking around at the kind of landscape of organizations that all fall apart for the same reasons, it becomes pretty clear that we need to start doing what we can to transform the way that we interact with each other and deal with conflict before we get to a revolutionary point, because we can't get to that point unless we can actually build communities together that function and that keep people safer than they currently are.
Just to say as well, I think the political ideas of socialism have an enormous relevance to the struggles that we're engaged in now, but they're never going to be applied by people who enter movements thinking they know what needs to be done. And simply come in and say, listen, this is the plan. This is what you need to be doing. This is how you have to deal with the employer. This is how you have to deal with the cops. This is what, there's no possible way. Any serious socialist who is looking to begin to intervene in movements must consider it that they've got a huge amount to learn and must conduct themselves respectfully. And I've seen so many examples. I remember one time watching somebody from an unnamed political group intervening intervening with a meeting in which a bunch of Palestinian people were putting forward their perspective, and he was explaining to them why their ideas were completely wrong and what needed to happen in Palestine. And as they put forward their arguments, he looked at them with this kind of patronizing, these people obviously don't understand anything about Palestine sort of attitude. It reached the level of complete, that's an extreme manifestation, but I think it has been part of the problem. This is an incredibly, we really are in uncharted waters in so many ways in this present period. And if socialism is going to be applied meaningfully, it's going to have to be applied. There's going to be a huge learning process involved and a huge deal of experimentation involved.
Yeah, the waters are uncharted, but we can take a compass, if you like, from the past, if we can use that metaphor, right? Like that's the socialist theory should give us tools to try to navigate, but it doesn't tell us, what seas we're sailing on.
Dead right.
And I think the question of for people who are in socialist organizations, the better one or ones that have actually had some meaningful experience in social struggle, there's the importance of humility and not overgeneralizing from those experiences, right? Because I think that's and recognizing the specificity of the experience. And we've had an experience in a particular province at a particular time that's valid and important and worth learning from. But we're living in a society, it's a very complex society, over an enormous geographical space, the Canadian state. And I think that I'll just throw in one piece of that, I think, is that there's a history of people trying to, for example, build Toronto-centric organizations and generalizing from the experience of that particular place across the entire Canadian state, which is just silly. I think the significant socialist organizations will only be built by the coming together of projects that are going to initially be regional or local. And there'll have to be some, processes of dialogue, joint work, and hopefully eventual unification that are built out of those different places. And anyone who thinks their existing organization is going to be the basis of simply through cloning or something, from one region to become the organization that will be in its current form but larger, the thing that we need across the entire Canadian state, I think is just not very serious about that. So I think there are people in the existing organizations who I consider comrades, and I think have important contributions to make, but and their organizations can sometimes play significant roles on a small scale. But where we're at is just that none of those organizations, as was said before, are the nucleus of thing that we could call a party. And so there needs to be, even for people who think their particular social organizations are, the one they want to be in, and they're very confident in them, the fact that they haven't convinced, huge numbers of people that that's the case means that there needs to be that humility and a willingness to work together on the basis of responding to the challenges and the struggles that we face.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on the question of socialist organization?
I guess just real quick, I totally agree with what you just said. I think we do need some sort of organizational body, or bodies plural, because individually we are fundamentally disempowered as working class people. So we do need to organize to win, and ideally, learn from each other's struggles and share what we've learned, even though it is contextual with that very, very necessary humility. But I think that whatever that looks like, it can't just be declared, and especially declared by, people who probably live in Toronto and are, at least to some extent, removed from the really core spheres of production, right? There was I think about when the big wave of Amazon unionizing started. Not that many socialist organizations were involved or even aware that was happening until the news broke, right? And I think that shows that there's kind of a disconnect between where a lot of theorizing happens and where sort of on the ground organizing in the places that it's the most disruptive to capital are occurring. So I think ideally I'd like to see a meaningful sort of bridging of the two. Obviously, I think political theory is very, very important, but sort of practically learning those organizing skills are also invaluable. And I think, even if we're not doing things in the best way we could be doing them, and we're making mistakes, that's still vital experience that's going to be necessary for us to take forward. I'd like to see more of that.
And I think it's worth mentioning too that, and this may be relevant to some people listening to the podcast, that it's almost always possible for socialists to form local reading groups, study circles, so that they have a space to come together with like-minded people. This is not an alternative to being involved in broader organizing through a union or in a community organization of some kind. But just because you're not part of a larger socialist group, because there isn't one where you are, or you're not politically confident in any of the existing groups, that doesn't mean that people can't be engaged in some of that. Those kinds of conversations where you could have opportunities to come together and discuss things and invite other activists into those spaces, so that there is a kind of a ferment, even if it's at a very low level, of political conversation that's informed by experiences of organizing, but not in the same spaces as the actual organizing, right? And it's those study groups, discussion circles, and so on that could potentially help generate new political organizations on a local level, or perhaps beyond that. And I do think we should try to encourage people to absolutely not be insular, to get out there and be involved if you're not already involved in some form of activity that you think is significant, whether in the workplace or the community. But in addition, to look for those opportunities to bring together people who are curious about socialist ideas and so on, because it's wonderful now that there's so many opportunities to listen to Zoom panels and podcasts and so on. But that's a pretty one-way, right, forum for engaging with socialist ideas, and there's no substitute for people actually talking amongst themselves, so that it's less of a solitary process, right? To just read or listen or watch on your own. And it's wonderful that there's so many people who are doing it on YouTube or wherever else. But we do need those other spaces where people can talk with each other and talk through ideas wherever possible. Among like-minded people in the same place.
Could I perhaps just make the point that perhaps begin to move towards a close here, it just seems to me that this whole discussion has been really healthy in a couple of ways. I mean, it's registered a certain level of uncertainty that I think reflects the realities of fighting for socialism in the present context. And in some ways, I think people that were more certain would have been whistling in the dark at the moment. But at the same time, at an earlier period, a discussion of people like us would have involved a great deal more certainty. And I do think we need to reestablish that sense of certainty. But that is going to be a very difficult process and a very challenging process. But I must say, I came into this discussion with us, which I've had for a while, a strong sense that socialism was by no means inevitable, but entirely possible. And I do say everything that's been said here has reinforced that sense for me. I think we're at a really incredible time, and I think there's real possibilities, and there's going to be an incredible fight. And I'd finally just like to endorse James's point that I think that that we don't need revolutionary change. We don't need revolution simply because it's the right move to make on the chessboard at this moment. We need to make it because it's going to be bloody marvelous. And there is nothing more worthwhile than the struggle to defeat the present anachronistic, backward society we live in and create one that's really worthy of people.
Perhaps we will end it there, unless someone else would like to jump in.
John,
thank you.
The mic drop.
Thank you. I think this is great, and that's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.